All right, here to do a video on the metabolic hormones. Sort of give you an overview um, of the primary hormone functions, their stimuli, where they're from, their primary functions, and what you want to be able to do is sort of put them in context, sort of when they're most active, and also be able to sort of label the metabolic flow diagrams that we did previously so that you understand how they fit into that picture. But so let's start with probably some of the more well-known metabolic hormones. So let's start with insulin. You want to think of insulin as the primary postprandial hormone. By postprandial, that means after a meal. And so it's from the pancreatic beta cells. And the primary stimulus is blood glucose. I'm going to write nutrients here as our primary stimulus, because they are all stimulatory. Amino acids are stimulatory to it, but glucose is the by far the largest stimulus. You have a much bigger insulin spike after a high carbohydrate meal than a high protein meal. And so insulin acts sort of in that postprandial period to sort of help oppose the hyperglycemia that would otherwise occur. And we saw that actually with some of the GI hormones stimulating insulin, right, doing their GI functions, GIP, right, doing their GI functions, but also stimulating the metabolic hormones that are going to need to be active very shortly after the digestive process begins and the nutrients begin to be absorbed. And so the primary action that insulin has is it's hypoglycemic. Right? In other words, that's its response, its effect, I should say. It tends to make blood nutrient levels go down, and it does that by increasing GLUT4 insertion. Right, so there are multiple glucose transporters, glucose uptake transporters, GLUT. There are a variety of them. Only one of them is insulin dependent, GLUT4. It is found in skeletal muscle, striated muscle, but most of that is skeletal muscle and adipose tissue. And so it's going to stimulate that glucose uptake dramatically into the skeletal muscle stores and also help it to be converted to fat. Insulin is highly anabolic to fat. It is also hypolipidemic in its actions. It's fat sparing, if you will. It's tending to promote glucose uptake. That glucose can then be used as energy. It tends to be anabolic to fat, promotes fat uptake as well. More so fat storage than fat uptake, I should say, which promotes the uptake, sort of secondarily promotes the uptake. And so blood nutrient levels as a whole are falling. And it also stimulates amino acid uptake at skeletal muscle. It's also anabolic to muscle. Some anaerobic athletes will actually take insulin to promote muscle growth. A little crazy, but they are aware of the anabolic effects of insulin. It is also anti-catabolic to muscle. And what we're doing there, and what it's doing there is reducing the utilization of muscle protein for gluconeogenesis. If you recall, amino acids at the liver can funnel into gluconeogenic pathways going from pyruvate to glucose. And of course, we don't need to do that right after a meal. That's, we're stimulating this hormone that's being stimulated by the high glucose levels. So we don't need more glucose production. And means we don't need to mobilize muscle protein to be broken down into amino acids that can then be used for gluconeogenesis. So it's going to decrease gluconeogenesis. And again, liver. Okay. As I said before, it's anabolic to fat. So we'll just write that down. Increases fat stores. And it's also anabolic to the production of glycogen at the liver. So increase glycogen stores. Okay. That's most of what insulin does, right? So postprandial, nutrient uptake, anabolic to the storage of fat, to the storage of carbohydrates, anti-catabolic to protein, because we don't need to be mobilizing protein to make more glucose, right? Stimulated by the glucose. Okay, let's go to its counterpart, glucagon. Now, glucagon is also found or produced by cells cells of the pancreas, but in this case, the cells are the alpha cells. Right? And now the stimulus here is going to be low nutrients. And so you want to think of this hormone functionally as the sort of between the meals hormone that's helping to maintain blood nutrient levels. Now, sort of concomitant with that is the fact that catecholamines are stimulatory to glucagon, and we'll get to the rationale there in a second. So I'm going to just put norepinephrine / epinephrine. And the rationale there is that these two hormones rise dramatically during acute stress. And one example of that, of acute stress, would be exercise. And so an exercise increases, circulating catecholamines rise, and we need more nutrients to be delivered into the bloodstream to support the contracting muscles. And so we're going to get epinephrine, norepinephrine, sort of promoting their actions through glucagon. Now they're going to do it themselves as well, as we'll see shortly, but part of their action is mediated through glucagon. Okay, so what is glucagon doing? Right? Well, it is catabolic, right, as opposed to insulin, which was largely anabolic. Catabolic during fasting. And I would call that sort of acute fasting. So we're talking about hours here, not days, right? And because when we fast for a much more prolonged period, glucagon will continue to be active, but other hormones are going to kick in, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, cortisol, right? We've talked about that a little bit before. So let's see. So we're going to call glucagon, one of its effects is hyperglycemia or hyperglycemic as an adjective. Right? It's going to tend to cause an increase in circulating glucose levels. And this is largely through actions at the liver. Right? Remember, the skeletal muscle also stores a lot of glycogen. But the way that cortisol is going to increase blood sugar levels is at the liver. It can do that through glycogenolysis, so increased glycogenolysis, right? That's the breakdown of stored glycogen. But we can also go the other way and actually produce new glucose through gluconeogenesis. So we're going to get an increase in gluconeogenesis. Right? And I have AA there, meaning from amino acids. Right? So again, kind of the opposite of what we had up here where we were anti-catabolic to muscle. Now we're utilizing free, at least circulating amino acid levels, which would be resupplied to a degree from skeletal muscle, but we're utilizing those circulating amino acid levels to produce new glucose. And lastly here, it is hyperlipidemic. Right? And again, it seems like it's a bit of the antagonist opposite of insulin as it should be. And this would be at both liver and adipose tissue. And so what it's doing is it's increasing lipolysis, right? Lipolysis, breaking down of stored fats and releasing them into the bloodstream. Okay, I think we're good with insulin and glucagon. One other interesting point is that, I'll throw this on here, is that amino acids are actually, increase in amino acids is actually stimulatory to glucagon. And that makes sense if you have a high protein meal, because that high protein meal would also stimulate insulin. And to sort of protect the blood glucose levels during that high protein meal, we would want actually some sort of counteracting glucagon to sort of make sure that our blood sugar levels don't fall too high due to the insulin being stimulated by that meal. Okay, kind of makes sense. All right, let me shift pages here. And we'll go on to our more chronically active hormones. And so we'll talk about cortisol and growth hormone. Cortisol. So cortisol is secreted from the adrenal cortex, the zona fasciculata to be specific. It's obviously a steroid hormone, right? It's an OL, derived from cholesterol, so it's a lipophilic hormone. The stimulus for cortisol is chronic stress, and in addition, and we discussed this earlier when we talked about pituitary hormones, right? Because it's stimulated by ACTH. It is also on a sort of diurnal pattern of secretion, right? Stimulated by light-dark cycles. Okay, so what does cortisol do? Cortisol is our primary glucose sparing hormone. Now, let's back up just a second, right? Because we don't always put the hormones in their general context first. Insulin and glucagon were sort of the on-off, sort of right after meals, and then between meals. Insulin right after, glucagon between meals. Cortisol is there all the time, and it's permissive to the secretion of the catecholamines. I think we used this as an example of a permissive hormone earlier. But during more chronic stress, what cortisol is going to do is it's going to promote fat use, promote glucose production, and limit that right, because it would promote glucose production, but that production would be low enough that insulin levels wouldn't rise. And so what it's doing is it's promoting glucose production for the cells that need it, not for uptake at insulin-dependent sites, skeletal muscle and adipose tissue. Right? If you're fasting for a week, you don't need to be building fat stores from blood sugar that's being produced by the breakdown of your proteins, right? You wouldn't. It's essentially like turning your muscle into fat, um, in a very indirect way. But that's essentially what would be happening. It doesn't make any sense, right? So what we want to do is promote the use of the fat stores, promote the use of protein for glucose production, but then that glucose production is funneled toward the cell types that need it, right? And so those are high affinity glucose transporters. In other words, they'll move glucose even when glucose concentrations are relatively low compared to normal. Okay, so glucose sparing during chronic stress is permissive to fuel mobilization in general, permissive to the catecholamines, and it increases fat and protein use for energy sources. And again, the protein use would be funneled toward liver gluconeogenesis. Right? Liver gluconeogenesis is increasing blood glucose levels, right? And again, increasing to a low level, right? Because they're chronically low during fasting, right? Because remember, if you think about the size of the energy stores, carbohydrates, we only have about a day's worth of carbohydrates stored anyway in terms of calories, and so protein and then the glycogen that comes from the increased fat use, right? We're using the acetyl groups from beta oxidation to make ATP, but we're probably using the glycerol that's liberated for gluconeogenesis, right? So we can actually have an arrow that goes from here to here as well, right? And that would be the glycerol component. The fatty acids would be used for ATP production. Okay, so we're promoting fat use. We're using some amino acids from our protein stores in largely skeletal muscle to maintain our circulating glucose levels. And because of all this, it is hyperglycemic in its actions. It's tending to increase, and again, hyperglycemic, making them go up. That doesn't necessarily mean making them go up above normal, right? It's just saying that it is tending to promote an increase in blood sugar levels. Again, chronic fasting, they would tend to be low. So we're just trying to maintain them. Okay, let's see. It is hyperglycemic by decreasing uptake and increasing production. Right? We just said that up here, the increased production part. The decreased uptake would be by decreasing the glucose transporter, the insulin-dependent glucose transporter. Again, we don't want the sugar that we're making to be utilized by skeletal muscle. It's not like you're trying to enhance your ability to do exercise if you've been fasting for a week, right? We need glucose for central nervous system function, right? Above skeletal muscle function. Okay, there's cortisol. Let's do growth hormone. All right, again, we've been through this one before to a degree, right? Cliff Notes version here, right, it's a anterior pituitary hormone. It is on a circadian rhythm cycle, right? Goes up shortly after going to sleep, about 90 minutes after falling asleep. You get a big growth hormone spike, falls then during the night. And then during the day, you get spikes that coincide with meals and spikes that coincide with exercise. And if you think about the general function of growth hormone in terms of promoting growth, right after onset of sleep, sort of promoting growth and repair of tissues, and after meals, promoting nutrient uptake and growth and repair, and after exercise, again, similar idea, right? after exercise, repair of the tissues that are damaged, and as well as muscle growth that might need to be occurred that's adaptive to that exercise, to that particular stress. Right, so this is anterior pituitary. And what does it do? All right, so its primary, like, broad scale function is it increases lean body mass. Well, how does it do that? It does that largely by being, again, glucose sparing. It will promote glucose production. We saw this in the people that hypersecrete growth hormone, right? They also tend to be, right, the pituitary giants, the people with acromegaly, tend to have diabetes mellitus, right? Because they have this excess gluconeogenic function of growth hormone, glucose sparing function. Okay. And so it's increasing production, gluconeogenesis. Right? It's going to do a lot of that from glycerol liberated during the increased fat mobilization. Right, increased lipolysis. Again, we can draw an arrow from here to the gluconeogenesis. Right, so increased lipolysis. We're promoting fat use for energy. We're promoting blood sugar production. Now, one thing that's a little bit different here is that it is very anti-catabolic. Right, we tend to not say growth hormone is anabolic at some tissues. It does promote growth of some tissues. Remember, I think I said before that most research does not indicate it being directly anabolic to skeletal muscle. That doesn't mean it doesn't make your skeletal muscles grow. And the rationale there is that it is very anti-catabolic to skeletal muscle. So remember, skeletal muscle protein in general, turns over. And so we're being anabolic and catabolic simultaneously. And so think of those as sort of like two sort of balancing, if your skeletal muscle mass, largely determined by the expression of the contractile protein components, is stable, then the catabolism and anabolism of those proteins is about matched. If you're becoming more anti-catabolic, your growth hormone rises. If the anabolic stays the same and the anti-catabolic, or the catabolic falls, well, all of a sudden the anabolic is now winning, right? And you're turning over, right? You're turning over fewer proteins while you're building them. And so what happens is overall lean body mass will rise because of it, right? You're utilizing fat stores, and the lean muscle mass tends to rise because of the decrease in catabolic use of muscle tissue. Okay, I think we're good with growth hormone. Right, so last one is epinephrine. The epinephrine we need to think of, so big picture here for epinephrine is use during acute stress. So it's going to funnel into a stress response, one of the phases of a stress response. I think I'll do in a separate video. But let's look at the general functions. Get this out of the way of epinephrine. Now, we say epinephrine, we could just say catecholamines. I'll explain why here in a second. So I usually abbreviate that as epi. That's adrenal medulla derived, right? The adrenal medulla is made up of what are called chromaffin cells. chromaffin cells are modified neurons, essentially, that, in other words, they are the post-ganglionic, quote-unquote, neurons, but they're not neurons, right? They derived embryologically from neurons. But they are sort of the post-ganglionic cells in the sympathetic nervous system component that is neuroendocrine, right? So in a sympathetic response, you have all the neural wiring that releases norepinephrine, but then you have wiring to the adrenal medulla. So acute stress will be our stimulus here. And one version, the easiest example of acute stress is exercise. But so this acute stress stimulates sympathetic output at nerve endings, norepinephrine, but also to the adrenal medulla, which largely secretes epinephrine. About 80% of what it secretes is epinephrine, but the other 20% is norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is this oddball molecule that is both neurotransmitter and hormone, right? Epinephrine is essentially hormonal. Okay, so acute stress, we start to exercise, and what do we need during exercise? Well, besides the cardiovascular effects of epinephrine and things like that, and the effects on respiratory bronchioles, right, that would aid oxygen uptake, things like that would help promote exercise efficiency, aerobic production of ATP. Well, we need not only the oxygen to do that, we need the nutrients. And so epinephrine is going to be hyperglycemic. Right? Again, right? Skeletal muscle using lots of sugar. Yes, it has a lot of glycogen stored, but it will also, at least during more prolonged exercise, take up blood sugar and utilize that as well. And we're going to supply that blood sugar largely from the liver. Right? It's through glycogenolysis at the liver. It's also, again, think about more prolonged exercise, hyperlipidemic. Right? And there it's going to promote fat lipolysis, fat breakdown, and release from both liver, but now also adipose tissue. The actions of the catecholamines are very concentration dependent. So at rest, your catecholamine production, you always have catecholamine production, but at rest, your catecholamine production is doing very little in terms of regulating, controlling metabolism. But during chronic stress, that changes dramatically. You watch a scary movie, your blood sugar levels, you become hyperglycemic during that, during that acute stress. That is mediated through the alpha and beta receptors that bind epinephrine and norepinephrine. And those two receptor subtypes have their expression locations differ. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're found in the same place, but sometimes they don't. And there's also a difference in their affinity for the catecholamines. And so, again, it's going to depend upon what the concentration, the circulating concentration of epinephrine and norepinephrine are in binding these sort of alpha and beta receptors and mediating the glycogenolysis, and lipolysis that we see largely at the liver. The other thing that it tends to do, if you think about this, makes sense, is it's going to inhibit insulin. It's going to decrease insulin. Right? Because we don't want to be stimulating an increase in circulating blood sugar levels and then have insulin oppose that and shove it right back into the muscles. We can do, they will be delivered. It will be delivered to all cells, but we don't want to oppose the increase in circulating levels that we see that are caused directly by the epinephrine. Okay, I think I'll stop there. I'll probably do another video on the adaptive response to stress. That way we can sort of put these again into action. But in this term, in that scenario, rather than just, so this would sort of lay out the individual hormones. In that scenario, I think what I'll do is show you how they would be activated sequentially over time as fasting goes from acute to chronic, or a stress in general goes from acute to chronic. Fasting is just a really good example that makes sense with regard to supplying the cells with the nutrients they require. Other forms of stress will change these hormones, some of the epinephrine and cortisol, in similar ways, and you get these sort of abnormal circulating nutrient levels because of it, right? It tends to not be adaptive in those scenarios. Okay, come back to that.